Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones everyone else has forgotten. Sometimes the person who shows up to help is the last one you'd expect to stay. After a brutal storm rips through the Bitterroot Mountains, Delra Quinn rides out to check the damage. She's 58, lives alone, and prefers it that way. But when she finds Orin and Tella Varn standing in the ruins of their home, everything changes. They're in their late 70s, muddy and shaken, with nowhere to go and no one coming. The county won't help. Their family stopped calling years ago. Delra should ride on and let someone else deal with it. Instead, she looks at them and says 4 simple words that will change all their lives. What made her stay? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before the storm arrived, Delra Quinn woke to silence. That was how. Most of her mornings began no voices, no demands, just the steady breathing of solitude that had become her companion for the better part of 15 years. Her cabin sat at 7,200 feet, tucked into a fold of granite and pine, where the Bitterroot Range pressed against the sky. From her porch, she could see 30 miles of ridgeline, all of it empty except for the scattered homesteads that clung to the high country like barnacles on a ship's hull. She was 58 years old, lean and weathered in the way of people who spend their lives outside. Her hands were strong, scarred from years of work, first as a fire lookout for the Forest Service, then as something harder to define. A woman alone, a woman who preferred it that way. Her hair had gone silver early, and she kept it pulled back in a braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her face carried the map of her years, lines around her eyes from squinting at distant smoke, deeper grooves around her mouth from conversations she'd stopped having. The cabin was small but well kept. One room served as kitchen, living space, and workshop. A ladder led to a sleeping loft where she kept a narrow bed and a trunk containing everything she owned that mattered, which wasn't much. The walls were lined with shelves holding supplies, canned goods, dried beans, flour in sealed containers, medical supplies, rope, tools, everything organized, everything in its place. On a small desk beneath the window sat her fire lookout logbook, a leather-bound journal she'd kept since her first season in the tower back in 2008. She still made entries, even though she'd retired from the service 12 years ago. Weather observations, wildlife sightings, the changing of seasons. Sparse notes about the world beyond her walls. The logbook was a record of distance between herself and other people, between who she'd been and who she'd become. Delra pulled on her boots and stepped outside. Her horse, Stedman, stood in the small corral beside the cabin, a 14-year-old bay gelding with a white blaze and the patience of stone. She'd trained him herself, taught him to navigate the steep trails and to carry supplies without fuss. More than that, she'd taught him to go home alone if needed, following the scent trail back to the cabin with a note tied to his saddle. It was a trick she'd learned from an old packer, useful for emergencies in country where cell phones were useless and radios unreliable. She fed Stedman, checked his hooves, then walked the perimeter of her property. Everything was secure. The woodshed was full, the water tank topped off from the spring. She had a generator for the coldest months and enough fuel to run it sparingly through winter. By most measures, she was prepared for anything. The Bitterroot Ridge community wasn't much of a community anymore. 20 years ago, there'd been maybe 40 families scattered across the high country, people who valued space and self-reliance above convenience. Now there were fewer than 15 homesteads still occupied, and most of those by people in their 60s or older. The young ones had left for jobs in Missoula or further west. The ones who stayed were stubborn, broke, or both. Delra knew most of them by name, though she wouldn't call any of them friends. There was Garrett Hollis, a widower who ran a small cattle operation 5 miles north. The Pembrokes, a couple in their 70s who kept to themselves. And the Varns, Orin and Tella, who lived 8 miles southeast on a parcel they'd owned since the late 70s. She'd met the Varns only a handful of times over the years. Brief encounters at the general store in town or passing them on the trail. They were quiet people, dignified in their simplicity. Orin was tall and spare, with a carpenter's hands and a face carved by wind and work. Tella was smaller, quick-eyed, with silver hair she wore in a bun and a voice that still carried traces of the schoolteacher she'd been before, moving to the mountains. They kept their distance, and Delra respected that. Distance was a currency she understood. Her own history with connection had not ended well. She'd been married once, a long time ago. Married and divorced within 5 years, a clean break that left no children except the daughter she'd had before the marriage. Sophie, born when Delra was 23 and still figuring out who she was. The girl's father had been gone before Sophie was born, and Delra had raised her alone, cobbling together work and childcare, and a life that always felt like it was one missed paycheck from falling apart. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried. But somewhere between Sophie's teenage years and Delra's increasing need for space and silence, things had fractured. There'd been a fight 8 years ago, a bad one, the kind where things get said that can't be unsaid. Sophie had wanted to marry someone Delra didn't approve of, and Delra had made her. Opinion known with all the subtlety of a hammer, words about responsibility, about making the same mistakes Delra had made, about throwing your life away on someone who wouldn't stick around. Sophie had walked out, and then she'd stopped calling, stopped answering letters, changed her number. For 8 years, there'd been nothing but silence. Delra told herself it was better this way. People got tangled up in each other's lives, and then someone got hurt. Better to keep clean boundaries, to rely on yourself. She had her routines, her work, her mountain. She didn't need anyone. That morning, 3 days before the storm, she saddled Steadman and rode the ridge. It was part of her routine, checking the trail markers, looking for signs of wildlife or trouble, making mental notes of who needed help and who was doing fine. The sky was clear, the air cool with the promise of autumn. September in the high country was beautiful and brief, a last breath before winter clamped down hard. She, past the Pembroke place, saw smoke from their chimney, heard their dogs barking. No need to stop. She rode on, following the trail that wound through lodgepole pine and granite outcrops, crossing streams that ran cold and clear. The land up here was harsh, but it was honest. It didn't lie to you or make promises it couldn't keep. By afternoon, she'd circled back toward her cabin, stopping to water Steadman at a creek. That's when she noticed the sky. Clouds were building to the west, tall and dark, moving faster than they should. She watched them for a long moment, reading the patterns the way she'd learned during her years in the fire tower. This wasn't a typical autumn storm. The air had that electric feel, that heaviness that meant something big was coming. She rode hard for home, unsaddled Steadman, and started her preparations. Brought in extra firewood, secured the shutters, tied down anything that could blow away. She filled every container she had with water and moved her most valuable supplies into the root cellar. By evening, the wind had picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm hit just after midnight. Delra woke to the sound of wind tearing at the cabin walls, a roar like a freight train that didn't stop. Rain hammered the roof, so loud she couldn't hear herself think. She got up, checked the windows, the door, the roof beams. Everything held, but barely. The wind was ferocious, gusting hard enough to shake the entire structure. Lightning cracked across the sky in continuous flashes, turning night into a stuttering daylight. She stayed awake through all of it, sitting at her table with a lantern and her logbook, writing observations out of habit. Wind gusts estimated at 70 miles per hour. Rainfall rate extreme, at least 3 inches in the first hour. Temperature dropping fast. She could hear trees snapping in the distance, the deep cracking sounds that meant old-growth pines were coming down. The storm lasted 9 hours. By morning, the wind had died to a bitter whisper, and the rain had stopped. Delra stepped outside to survey the damage. Her cabin had held, but just barely. Shingles were torn from the roof, and one of the corral fence posts had been ripped clean out of the ground. Branches and debris littered the clearing. Stedman stood in the corner of the corral, unhurt but shaken. Beyond her property, the forest looked like a war zone. Trees down everywhere, some of them massive, their root balls torn from the earth. The trail she'd ridden 3 days ago was completely blocked. She knew, standing there in the grey morning light, that other homesteads had not been as lucky. Her cabin was built solid, anchored to bedrock, but some of the older places, the ones held together with hope and habit, would have taken serious damage, maybe worse. She saddled Stedman and packed supplies, rope, tarps, a first aid kit, tools. Then she set out to check on her neighbors. It took 2 hours to clear, enough of the trail to ride through. When she reached the Pembroke place, she found them shaken but intact, their dogs still barking. They told her they'd heard a huge crash to the southeast during the storm, something that sounded like a building collapsing. Delra's chest tightened. Southeast meant the Varn place. She told the Pembrokes to stay put, then turned Stedman toward the higher trail. The ride took another hour, slow going over downed trees and washed-out sections. When she finally crested the ridge and looked down into the shallow valley where the Varns lived, her stomach dropped. The homestead was destroyed. The main house, a log structure that had stood for nearly 50 years, had collapsed entirely. The roof was gone, blown off or caved in, and the walls had buckled inward. What remained looked like a pile of timber and shattered glass. The barn was still standing, barely, one wall listing at a dangerous angle. Debris covered the ground, belongings, furniture, pieces of a life scattered across the mud. And standing in the middle of it all, like 2 trees that had somehow refused to fall, were Orin and Tella Varn. Delra rode Stedman down the slope slowly, picking her way through the wreckage. Orin and Tella didn't move as she approached. They stood on what had once been their porch, now just a platform of splintered boards jutting from the ruins. Orin held a walking stick, a beautiful piece of carved ash wood that Delra recognized from the few times she'd seen him in town. Tella's hands gripped Orin's arm, her knuckles white. They were covered in mud, their clothes torn and filthy. Tella's face was pale, her silver hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Orin's eyes were distant, staring at the destruction, as if he couldn't quite make sense of it. Neither of them looked at Delra as she dismounted and tied Stedman to a tree that was still standing. Orin, Tella. Delra kept her voice steady, calm. "Are you hurt?" It took a moment before Orin turned his head. When he met her eyes, she saw the shock there, the hollow disbelief of someone whose entire world had just been torn apart. "Miss Quinn," he said quietly. His voice was rough, scraped raw. "We're all right. We're fine." He was lying, of course. They weren't fine. But Delra understood the instinct, the need to say you're fine even when you're standing in the wreckage of your life. "Where were you when it hit?" Delra asked, stepping closer. "The cellar," Tella said. Her voice was thin, wavering. "We heard the wind coming and went down. It sounded like the whole world was ending. You did the right thing." Delra looked at the collapsed house, then back at them. "Is anyone else here? Family? Anyone coming to help?" Orin's jaw tightened. He shook his head slowly. "No, there's no one." Delra absorbed that. "No one coming." She glanced around the property, assessing. "What about supplies? Food, water, blankets?" "The cellar's intact," Orin said. "We've got some stores down there. Canned goods, root vegetables. Water from the well if it's still good." "I'll check it." Delra moved toward the barn first, testing the stability of the remaining wall. It was bad, but it might hold if they didn't get more wind. Inside, she found space that could serve as shelter, enough room for 3 people if they didn't need much. The roof leaked in a dozen places, but it was better than nothing. She returned to the Varns, who hadn't moved from their spot on the broken porch. Barns still standing. We can make it work for shelter tonight. Tomorrow I'll ride to town, report this, get the county out here. No. Tella's voice was sudden, sharp. No county, no officials. Delra frowned. Tella, you can't stay here. The house is gone. Winter's coming in 2 months. You need help. We're not leaving. Orin's voice was quiet but absolute. This is our land. We've been here 47 years. We're not going anywhere. Delra stared at them, trying to understand. Where would they take you? You have family? Had a son, Orin said. He died 20 years ago. Logging accident up north. Our daughter, she's back east somewhere. We haven't spoken in years. Haven't been able to reach her, Tella added, her voice cracking. We tried calling. Her number doesn't work anymore. We sent letters. They came back. The picture was becoming clearer. 2 elderly people, isolated and alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. The county would put them in some facility in Missoula, separate them maybe, ship them off to wherever there was space. They'd die there, away from the land they'd spent half a century making their own. We know we can't rebuild the house, Orin said. Not like it was, but we can make something. We've done it before. We built this place with our own hands in 77. We can do it again. Delra looked at them, really looked at them. Orin was close to 80, his body bent with arthritis and age. Tella was thinner than she should be, her breathing labored. They couldn't rebuild anything, not on their own. They'd be dead before the first snow if they tried to stay here without help. She should leave. She should ride to town, report it, let the authorities handle it. That's what any sensible person would do. She had her own life, her own routines. She didn't get involved in other people's problems. That's how she'd survived this long. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Tella's hands shook as she tried to smooth down her muddy skirt. Maybe it was the defeated slump of Orin's shoulders beneath his stubborn words. Or maybe it was the look in their eyes, not pleading, not asking for anything, just accepting that this was how their story ended. Delra thought about her own daughter, about how she'd let pride and distance turn years into silence, about how she'd chosen solitude over the messy, complicated work of staying connected. She thought about what it meant to be forgotten, to be left behind, to have no one show up when everything fell apart. She moved closer to the rubble, scanning the debris. Something caught her eye, a splash of color among the mud and broken wood. She reached down and pulled free a quilt, hand-stitched, heavy with water and filth. The fabric was torn in places, but she could see the pattern, interlocking squares, each one a different color and design. That's our wedding quilt, Tella said softly. I made it in 78. Every square is a memory. That blue one there, that's from my mother's dress. The red is from Orin's work shirt, the one he wore when we built the house. The yellow, that was from our son's baby blanket. Tella stepped down from the porch carefully, crossing the mud to where Delra stood. She took the quilt from Delra's hands and held it close, running her fingers over the stained fabric. Tears ran down her face, cutting tracks through the dried mud on her cheeks. She didn't sob or wail. She just stood there, holding this ruined piece of her history, and wept silently. Something broke in Delra's chest. Some wall she'd built carefully over years of isolation cracked clean through. She thought about her daughter again, about all the things she'd lost because she was too stubborn to bend, too afraid to reach out. She thought about dying alone in her cabin one day, with no one to hold the pieces of her life, no one to remember what any of it meant. I'll stay, Delra heard herself say. Orin looked up, confused. What? I'll stay with you. She met his eyes, then Tella's. We'll make it work, get through winter, figure out the rest in spring. Miss Quinn, Orin started. Delra, just Delra. She took a breath. I've got supplies at my place. I can bring them here. We'll fix up the barn, make it livable. It won't be comfortable, but it'll keep you alive. Why? Tella asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Delra didn't have a good answer. Or maybe she had too many answers, all of them tangled up in regret and loneliness and the sudden, desperate need to do something right for once. "Because someone should," she finally said. "Because you shouldn't have to be alone." The relief on their faces was almost painful to see. Orin's shoulders sagged, and he leaned heavily on his walking stick. Tella reached out and gripped Delra's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you, thank you." Delra squeezed her hand once, then let go. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of work ahead." She looked around the property, already making plans. "First thing, I need to check the well and the cellar. Then we'll see what we can salvage. I'll need to get Steadman back to my cabin with a message for anyone who passes through. He knows the way home." She worked quickly, scribbling a note on paper from her pack. "At Varn Place, storm damage severe. Staying to help. Don't send county unless emergency." She folded it into a waterproof pouch and tied it securely to Steadman's saddle, then sent him off with a pat and a word. The horse turned without hesitation and started back up the trail toward home. By evening, they'd cleared enough space in the barn to set up a makeshift shelter. Delra helped the Varns salvage blankets and clothes from the wreckage, found a camp stove that still worked, gathered enough timber to build a fire. The cellar yielded food supplies, more than she'd expected. Orin had been prepared, at least for this. They sat around a small fire that night, eating heated beans and drinking water boiled clean. Nobody talked much. The Varns were exhausted, still in shock. Delra watched them across the flames and wondered what she'd just committed herself to. One night had become a season. Maybe more. She barely knew these people, but then again, she barely knew anyone anymore. "We'll start tomorrow," she said, reinforcing the barn, building proper bunks, figuring out food and water. "We'll take it one day at a time." Orin nodded slowly. Tella reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 50 years together. "We won't forget this," Orin said. "What you're doing." Delra stirred the fire, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Just get some rest. We'll need our strength." She lay awake long after they'd fallen asleep, listening to the wind in the trees and the settling sounds of the wrecked homestead. She thought about her daughter, about the fights and the silence, about all the ways she'd failed at connection. Maybe this was her chance to do better. Maybe staying wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about proving to herself that she was still capable of it, of choosing people over solitude, of staying when it would be easier to leave. The fire burned low, and eventually, Delra slept. Morning came cold and clear. Delra woke first, her body stiff from sleeping on hard ground. She'd given the Varns the better blankets and taken a thin bedroll for herself, and now her back complained about it. She stood slowly, working the kinks out of her muscles, and stepped outside the barn. The damage looked worse in daylight. The main house was a total loss. There was no salvaging it. But the barn, with work, could be made livable. The well was intact, the water good. The cellar was solid. They had the basics for survival. Everything else would be improvisation. She started a fire and put coffee on to boil. When Orin and Tella emerged from the barn, moving stiffly, she handed them tin cups and watched as the hot liquid brought some life back to their faces. Tella's cough from the day before seemed better, but Delra made a mental note to watch for it. Orin moved like a man whose joints hurt, but he strapped on his tool belt, worn leather with hand tools hooked to it, and declared himself ready to work. "We need a plan," Delra said. She'd been thinking about it all night. Priority 1 is shelter. We need to reinforce the barn, patch the roof, build proper bunks. Priority 2 is securing a reliable water source and food storage. Priority 3 is preparing for winter firewood, insulation, medical supplies. Orin nodded. "I can do carpentry. Built most of this place myself, back in the day. My hands aren't what they were, but I remember how. I can help with organizing," Tella offered. sorting through what's salvageable, making inventory. I'm not much use for heavy lifting anymore. That's good, Delra said. We need someone keeping track of supplies. I'll handle the heavy work and anything that requires climbing or strength. They fell into a rhythm quickly. Delra worked on clearing debris and reinforcing the barn's weakest wall, using salvaged timber and rope to create temporary supports. Orin measured and cut new boards for the roof patches, his movements slow but precise. Tella went through the cellar, making lists of what they had: 30 jars of preserved vegetables, dried beans, flour, salt, sugar, a side of bacon that had somehow survived. Not enough for 3 people through a full winter, but a start. By midday, Delra had shored up the barn wall and started on the roof. The work was hard, physical, the kind of labor that made her muscles burn and her hands bleed. But it felt good, purposeful. She'd spent so many years maintaining only herself, her own small world. There was something different about working for others, about building something that would shelter more than just herself. Orin worked alongside her when he could, though she noticed him wincing with pain when he bent or reached. His arthritis was bad, worse than he wanted to admit. She started assigning him tasks that didn't require as much physical strain: measuring, planning, organizing tools. He accepted the adjustment without comment, and she respected him for it. Tella's cough returned in the afternoon, a dry, hacking sound that worried Delra. She made Tella rest and brewed tea from pine, needles and honey they'd salvaged. Tella protested but drank it, and the cough eased some. Still, Delra filed it away as a concern. Medical care was 12 miles away in town, and the trails were barely passable. If Tella got seriously sick, they'd be in trouble. That evening, after another meal of simple food cooked over the fire, they sat together and talked. Real conversation this time, not just logistics. Orin told stories about building the homestead in '77, how he'd been a carpenter in Missoula, good with his hands, but tired of working for other people. Tella had been teaching elementary school, and they'd both wanted something different, something that belonged to them. We saved for 3 years, Tella said. Every penny. Bought this land for almost nothing because no one else wanted it. Too remote, too harsh. But we saw what it could be. Built the house ourselves, Orin added. Took 2 summers. I did the framing and the roof. Tella did everything. Else chinked the logs, built the cabinets, laid the stone hearth. Our son was born the year after we moved in. This place, it's where he grew up, where he learned to walk and talk and work with his hands. The mention of their son hung in the air. Delra didn't push, but Tella continued anyway. His name was Jacob. He looked just like Orin, tall, strong, good with tools. He went north to work the logging camps when he was 22. We didn't want him to go, but he needed to find his own way. The accident happened 6 months later, Orin said quietly. A tree fell wrong. He died instantly, they told us. Didn't suffer. Delra thought about her own daughter, the silence between them. At least the Varns had had time with their son, had known him and loved him. She'd let Sophie slip away while they were both still alive, still had a chance to fix things. That seemed worse somehow. I have a daughter, Delra found herself saying. Sophie, we haven't spoken in 8 years. Tella looked at her with gentle curiosity. What happened? I said things I shouldn't have. She wanted to marry someone I didn't approve of, and I told her she was making a mistake. Told her she was throwing her life away, that she'd end up alone and struggling like I had been. Delra stared into the fire. She married him anyway, cut me out completely, changed her number, moved away. I don't even know where she is now. Have you tried to reach out? Tella asked. No. Delra's voice was flat. I figured if she wanted to talk, she'd call. I'm not going to beg. Orin made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Pride's a hell of a thing. Keeps us warm right up until it kills us. Delra looked at him sharply, but his expression wasn't judgmental, just sad, knowing. Maybe, she admitted, Our daughter Patrice, she's somewhere back east, Tella said. We haven't heard from her in 5 years. Last we knew, she was struggling. Addiction? Bad choices. We tried to help, but she pushed us away, said we were trying to control her life. Maybe we were, Orin said. Maybe we held on too tight after losing Jacob. Either way, she's gone. We tried calling a few years back. Number was disconnected. Sent letters. They came back marked, "Return to sender." So we stopped trying. They sat in silence. 3 people who'd all lost connections they couldn't figure out how to repair. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Delra thought about patterns, about how people repeated the same mistakes, built the same walls. She wondered if it was too late to change, or if staying here with the Varns was just another way of avoiding the real work of reconnecting with her own daughter. "We should get some rest," she finally said. "Tomorrow we'll start on the bunks and work on getting more firewood." They settled in for the night, and this time Delra slept a little easier. The work ahead was enormous, maybe impossible, but for the first time in years, she wasn't alone in it. That had to count for something. The second week brought both progress and complications. The barn was taking shape as living quarters, 3 crude but functional bunks built into the walls, a stone hearth cobbled together from salvaged materials, shelves for supplies. The roof still leaked in 2 places, but Delra had patched the worst of it, with canvas tarps weighted down by stones. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep them dry. Tella's cough had worsened, despite the tea and rest. She tried to hide it, turning away when the spasms came, but Delra heard it at night, deep, rattling sounds that spoke of something more serious than a cold. She'd brought basic medical supplies from her cabin, but nothing that would help with a lung infection. They needed a doctor, or at least antibiotics, and that meant town. On the 8th day, they had a visitor. Delra heard the horse before she saw the rider Garrett Hollis on his grey mare, picking his way carefully through the debris. He pulled up short when he saw the destroyed homestead, his weathered face going pale. "Jesus," he breathed. "I heard the storm was bad, but we're all right," Orin called out. He was sitting on a makeshift bench outside the barn, working on carving a new handle for an axe. "Still here." Garrett dismounted and walked over, looking between the 3 of them. His eyes lingered on Delra. "You're staying?" "For now," Delra said. She didn't elaborate. Garrett shook his head slowly. "Winter's coming. 2 months, maybe less before the first big snow. This barn won't hold up to what this mountain throws at it." "We're working on it," Delra said, her voice sharper than intended. "We'll manage. I'm not saying you won't." Garrett held up his hands. "I'm just saying it's going to be hard, real hard. You folks should think about going to town for the winter. There's facilities." "We're not leaving," Tella said. She'd emerged from the barn, wrapped in a blanket, despite the mild afternoon. "This is our home." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. If you need help, you know where I am. 5 miles north. I can bring supplies if you run short." "We appreciate that," Orin said. After Garrett left, Delra felt the weight of his words settling over them. He was right. Winter would be brutal. They had maybe 2 months to prepare, and they were already behind. She made a decision. "I need to go to town," she said. "Get more supplies. Medicine for Tella. We need to stock up while the trails are still passable." "I'll go with you," Orin offered. "No, you need to keep working here, and someone needs to stay with Tella." Delra was already making a list in her head. "I'll take Stedman, load him up with trade goods, be back in 2 days." The trip to town took longer than expected. The trails were worse than she'd thought, washed out in places, blocked by fallen trees in others. She had to backtrack twice, finding alternate routes. By the time she reached the general store in the small mountain town of Derby, it was late afternoon, and she was exhausted. The store owner, Mrs. Brennan, raised her eyebrows when Delra walked in. "Heard you were helping the Varns?" That true? News traveled fast in small communities. It's true. That's good of you. Mrs. Brennan started pulling items from the shelves as Delra called out her list. Those two have been coming here for near about 40 years. Good people. Quiet, but good. Shame about what happened. Delra paid for the supplies with cash and trade. She'd brought furs and handcrafted items to barter with. As she was loading everything onto Stedman, a woman approached her. Well-dressed, probably in her 50s, with the kind of polished look that didn't belong in mountain country. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you the one helping Orin and Tella Varn?" "Who's asking?" "I'm Sandra Cook. I work for the county social services. We received a report about their situation." Delra's spine stiffened. "They're fine. They're staying on their land." "Miss," Sandra checked a clipboard. "Miss Quinn, is it? I understand you're trying to help, but those people are in their late 70s. They can't survive a winter in a damaged barn. They need proper care, proper facilities. What they need is to be left alone," Delra said. "They've been taking care of themselves for 50 years. They don't need the county coming in and shipping them off to some home where they'll die alone and miserable." Sandra's expression hardened. "We have protocols for situations like this. Elderly individuals in unsafe living conditions. Their living conditions are fine. I'm making sure of it." "For how long? What happens when you get tired of playing caretaker and go back to your own life? What happens when one of them gets seriously ill or injured, or when the food runs out?" The questions hit harder than Delra wanted to admit. Because they were fair questions. What was she doing? How long could she sustain this? "We'll manage," she said. "I'll be filing a report," Sandra said. "Someone will be coming out to assess the situation in the next few weeks." Delra mounted Stedman without another word and rode out of town. The encounter left her angry and unsettled. She knew Sandra was just doing her job, but the idea of the Varns being forced off their land, separated, institutionalized, it felt wrong, deeply wrong. The return journey gave her time to think about why she was doing this, about whether it was sustainable, about what happened when winter came and the reality of their situation became undeniable. But underneath those practical questions was something else, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Connection, maybe. Purpose. The sense that for the first time in years, what she was doing actually mattered to someone besides herself. She reached the homestead after dark, tired and sore. Orin and Tella were waiting, relieved to see her. She unloaded the supplies, including antibiotics she'd gotten from the pharmacist, with a story about her own chest cold. She gave them to Tella with instructions, and the older woman took them without argument. That night, as they sat around the fire, Tella brought out a small, waterproof box from the cellar. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, spanning 50 years. Pictures of a young Orin and Tella standing in front of their newly built house, their son as a baby, as a child, as a young man. Pictures of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary days. Pictures of their daughter, Patrice, as a girl with pigtails and gap-toothed smile. "This is why we can't leave," Tella said softly. "This land holds every memory we have. Leaving would be like leaving them all behind. Jacob, Patrice, when she was young, all the years we spent building this life. I know it sounds foolish." "It's not foolish," Delra said. She understood better than they knew. Sometimes places held pieces of us that couldn't be carried away. Sometimes staying was the only way. To keep hold of who you'd been, who you'd loved, what you'd built. They went through the photographs together, Tella and Orin telling stories, remembering. Delra listened, and in their memories, she found echoes of her own Sophie as a little girl. The years before everything fell apart. She realized with a sharp ache how much she'd lost by letting pride keep her silent. When they finally went to sleep, Delra lay awake in her bunk, listening to Tella's breathing and Orin's soft snoring. She thought about her daughter and wondered, not for the first time, if it was too late to reach out, if too much time had passed, if too much damage had been done. But the Varns' unopened letters to Patrice, the disconnected phone number, those felt like a warning. Don't wait too long. Don't let pride win. She made a promise to herself in the darkness. When spring came, if they made it through winter, she would try to find Sophie. She would reach out, even if it meant swallowing every bit of pride she had left. She would try. By the end of the first month, the barn had been transformed. What had started as a damaged outbuilding now functioned as a compact living space. 3 sturdy bunks, a working hearth with a chimney. Orin had helped design, shelves stocked with supplies, and hooks on the walls for clothes and tools. The leaks were patched, the walls insulated with salvaged materials and moss. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm and dry. Delra had fallen into a routine she hadn't planned for. Mornings began with coffee and planning the day's work. They'd divide tasks based on ability, Delra handling anything that required strength or climbing, Orin working on detailed carpentry or repairs, Tella managing inventory and cooking. Afternoons were spent working until the light failed. Evenings, they gathered around the fire, ate together, and talked. The antibiotics had helped Tella's cough, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Delra watched her carefully, noting the way she moved slower each day, how she needed more rest. Orin's arthritis flared with the dropping temperatures. Some mornings his hands were so stiff he couldn't grip his tools until Delra heated water for him to soak them in. They were getting older, more fragile. The mountain didn't care about age or determination. Winter would come regardless, and it would test all of them. Tella's recipe box became a centerpiece of their evenings. She'd saved it from the wreckage, a small wooden box containing handwritten cards stained with use and memory. Each recipe told a story: her mother's biscuit recipe from 1952, a stew she'd made for Orin on their first anniversary, Jacob's favorite chocolate cake. Cooking together from these cards became something sacred, a way of keeping the past alive. One evening, Delra found herself making bread alongside Tella, their hands working the dough in rhythm. Tella hummed, while she worked, an old hymn Delra half remembered from childhood. The domesticity of it, the simple act of making food together, felt foreign and familiar at once. She'd lived alone for so long she'd forgotten what this felt like. The easy companionship, the shared purpose. "You're good at this," Tella said, watching Delra shape the loaves. "My mother taught me, long time ago." Delra hadn't thought about her mother in years. She died when Delra was in her 30s, their relationship always complicated, never resolved. "You should teach someone someday," Tella said. "Pass it on. That's how things survive, through teaching, through sharing." Delra thought about Sophie, wondered what she might have taught her daughter if she'd had the patience, if she'd been less focused on just surviving and more focused on living. "Maybe," she said quietly. The first real conflict came in the second week of October. They were building a windbreak on the north side of the barn, a structure of logs and branches designed to deflect the worst of the winter storms. Delra had designed it based on techniques she'd learned during her fire lookout years. Orin had different ideas, wanted to build it higher and at a different angle. They argued about it politely at first, then with increasing frustration. Delra insisted her way would work better with the mountain's wind patterns. Orin countered that he'd lived here for 47 years and knew how the weather moved through this valley. Neither would budge. Finally, Delra snapped. "We're doing it my way. I'm the one with experience building in conditions like this." "Experience doesn't replace knowing the land," Orin shot back, his voice rising. "You're a guest here, Delra. Don't forget that." The words landed hard. A guest. After everything she'd done, all the work and sacrifice, she was still just a guest. Delra dropped the tools she was holding and walked away, too angry to speak. She spent the rest of the day working alone on other tasks, and Orin did the same. They didn't speak at dinner, the silence heavy and uncomfortable. Tella watched them both with sad, knowing eyes, but said nothing. The next morning, Delra found Orin already at the windbreak site. He'd started building it using her design. When she approached, he didn't look up from his work. "Your way makes more sense," he said quietly. "I was being stubborn." Delra picked up a log and helped him position it. "I should have listened to your suggestion about the angle. We can adjust it." They worked together in silence for a while. Then Orin stopped and leaned on his tool belt. "I'm sorry for what I said. About you being a guest. That was wrong. You're not a guest. You're—" he struggled for the word. "Your family, if you'll have us." Something loosened in Delra's chest. Family. She'd spent so long running from that word, from the obligations and vulnerabilities it carried. But hearing it now, from this man who had every reason to hold her at arm's length, it felt different. It felt like coming home. "I'm sorry too," she said, "for being controlling, for thinking I know everything." "You know plenty," Orin said with a slight smile. "Just not everything." That evening, Tella mediated with stories of her own marriage, the fights she and Orin had had over the years, the stubbornness on both sides, the learning to compromise. "Marriage is two people building something together," she said. "Sometimes you use his tools, sometimes you use hers. What matters is the building, not who's right." Delra thought about that later, lying in her bunk. Not just about marriage, but about any relationship, about how she'd approached her fight with Sophie, so certain she was right, so unwilling to bend. What had that certainty cost her? 8 years of silence, 8 years of her daughter's life she knew nothing about. She pulled out her fire lookout logbook and wrote by lantern light. Not weather observations this time, but something more personal. Thoughts about connection, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. About how the Varns had taught her, was still teaching her, that needing people wasn't weakness. That staying was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. The first snow came a week later, earlier than any of them had hoped. They woke to find the world transformed, everything white and silent. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. Delra, Orin, and Tella stood outside the barn together, watching the snow fall in the grey morning light. "Winter's here," Orin said. "We're ready," Delra replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Tella reached out and took both their hands, forming a small circle of 3. "We'll make it through," she said firmly. "All 3 of us. Together." They stood there for a moment, hands linked, watching the snow cover the ruins of the old homestead and blanket the new life they were building. Delra felt something shift. Inside her, a commitment deeper than the one she'd made standing in the wreckage that first day. This wasn't about duty anymore, or guilt, or trying to prove something to herself. This was about love, the complicated, difficult, beautiful work of choosing to stay with people even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "Together," she echoed, and meant it with everything she had. 6 weeks into their arrangement, the reality of winter settled over them like a heavy blanket. The snow had accumulated to nearly 2 feet, and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing during the day. The barn stayed warm, thanks to their careful preparations, but the world outside had become hostile and unforgiving. Daily life compressed into smaller, more intimate patterns. Morning coffee around the fire, careful rationing of supplies, shared meals at the small table Orin had built, evening card games and conversation. The close quarters forced a kind of honesty. There was nowhere to hide, no space to retreat to when tensions rose or emotions ran high. Delra noticed small things she'd never paid attention to before. The way Orin hummed while he worked, the same 3 bars of a song over and over. How Tella always arranged things in pairs, cups, plates, utensils, as if symmetry could hold chaos at bay. The way they touched each other constantly, small gestures of connection, a hand on a shoulder while passing, fingers intertwined while sitting. After 50 years together, they still reached for each other. It made Delra ache for something she'd never had. She'd been married once, briefly, but it had never felt like this, like two people who'd grown into a single organism, each one completing the other's thoughts and movements. She'd spent her adult life believing she didn't need that independence was enough. But watching the Varns, she realized she'd been lying to herself. Everyone needed someone. The only question was whether you were brave enough to let them in. One afternoon, while Orin and Delra were outside splitting wood, he pulled out a yellowed document from his shirt pocket. "I need to show you something," he said. It was the land deed, the original document from 1977, showing their purchase of 40 acres. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the details were clear. Orin and Tella Varn, owners of record. And below that, in Orin's handwriting, to be inherited by Patrice Varn, our daughter. "My will says the same thing," Orin said. "Everything goes to her. The land, whatever's left of value, all of it." Delra studied the document. "Have you been able to reach her?" "No. Last number we had disconnected, letters returned. We've tried." His voice was thick with pain. "I don't know if she's alive or dead, safe or suffering. We failed her somehow, after Jacob died. Held on too tight, pushed too hard. She ran, and we let her go. Why are you showing me this? Because I need you to understand what we're fighting for. This, a land, it's all we have left to give her. If we leave, if we let the county take it, Patrice will have nothing. No inheritance, no connection to where she came from. I know it seems foolish, two old people clinging to dirt and memories, but it's not just for us. It's for her, even if she never comes back." Delra folded the deed carefully and handed it back. "We'll find her. When the pass clears in spring, we'll hire someone to track her down. There are ways, public records, social media, private investigators. She's out there somewhere. What if she doesn't want to be found? What if she's spent all these years building a life without us? Then at least you'll know," Delra said. "At least you'll have tried." That night, another storm rolled in. The weather report from Garrett, who'd stopped by 2 days earlier, had warned them it would be severe, possibly the worst of the season so far. They prepared as best they could. Extra firewood stacked inside, all the shutters secured, the food and water within easy reach. Then they settled in to wait. The storm hit just after midnight. Delra woke to the sound of wind screaming around the barn, so loud it drowned out thought. The entire structure shook with each gust, timbers creaking ominously. Snow and ice battered the walls with a sound like thrown gravel. The temperature inside dropped despite the fire, their breath visible in the air. For 3 days, they were trapped inside. 72 hours of close quarters, limited movement, and the constant fear that the barn might not hold. They rationed the firewood carefully, burning just enough to keep from freezing. Food was sparse. They couldn't risk opening the door to get to the cellar stores, so they survived on what they had in the barn. By the second day, they were down to dried meat and stale bread. The confinement intensified everything. Small irritations became magnified. Tella's cough returned with a vengeance, keeping all of them awake at night. Orin grew, quiet and withdrawn, staring at the walls with an expression Delra had learned to recognize, despair barely held at bay. Delra herself felt the walls pressing in, the old panic of being trapped with nowhere to run. But something else happened too. In the forced stillness, with nothing to do but survive and wait, they talked, really talked. Tella told stories about her childhood during the Depression, about learning to make do with nothing. Orin spoke about his father, a mean drunk who'd beaten him regularly until Orin was big enough to fight back. Delra found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone about Sophie's father, abandoning her, about the years of poverty and struggle, about the day she'd driven Sophie away with words meant to wound. On the second night of the storm, Tella's cough became so severe, Delra thought they might lose her. The older woman couldn't catch her breath, her lips turning slightly blue. Delra held her upright, rubbing her back, while Orin boiled, water for steam and prayer. For 2 hours, they fought for Tella's life in that small barn, while the storm raged outside. Slowly, agonizingly, the cough eased. Tella's breathing steadied. She fell into an exhausted sleep, and Orin collapsed beside her, his face wet with tears. Delra sat watching them both, her heart pounding. How close they'd come to losing her. How quickly everything could end. That night, Orin broke down completely. He sat by Tella's bunk, holding her hand, and wept like a child. "I can't lose her," he said, his voice ragged. "Not her. Not after Jacob. I won't survive it, Delra. I won't." Delra knelt beside him and put her hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to lose her. She's strong. She's going to make it." "We're running out of time," Orin said. "Both of us. We're old. We're sick. And we're fooling ourselves thinking we can stay here forever. But if we leave, if we let them put us in some facility, we'll die anyway. Just slower, more miserable. Then we don't leave," Delra said firmly. "We stay, and we fight, and we make it to spring. And then we find Patrice, and we figure out what comes next. But we don't give up. Not now." Orin looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Delra thought about that, about all the reasons: the guilt over Sophie, the loneliness, the need to prove she could still care about someone. But underneath all of that was something simpler. "Because you matter," she said. "Because your lives matter, and your love matters, and the idea that two people could spend 50 years building something together that's worth protecting, that's worth fighting for." The storm finally broke on the 3rd day. They emerged from the barn to find the world buried under 4 feet of snow. Drifts reached halfway up the barn walls. The landscape was unrecognizable, everything transformed into abstract shapes of white. The cold was brutal, sharp enough to hurt. But they'd survived. All 3 of them, battered, exhausted, and frightened but alive. They stood together in the snow, arms around each other for warmth and support, and looked at what they'd endured. The barn had held. Their supplies had lasted. They'd made it through. "We're going to make it," Tella said, her voice hoarse but certain. "All the way to spring. I can feel it." Delra hoped she was right, because now they were truly isolated. The pass would be closed until March at the earliest, maybe April. No way out, no way to get help if something went wrong. They were on their own. 3 people against a mountain winter. All they had was each other, and the stubborn, fierce determination to survive. The week after the blizzard was spent digging out and assessing damage. The barn had held, but they'd gone through more firewood than planned. Food supplies were lower than Delra liked. They'd need to ration carefully to make it through to spring. The reality of their situation had never been clearer. They were committed now, for better or worse, until the snow melted and the pass reopened. Tella had recovered from her coughing episode, but she remained weak. She moved slowly, tired easily, and needed help with tasks she'd once done independently. Delra and Orin worked around her limitations without comment, redistributing chores and making adjustments. It was what you did for family. On a clear afternoon 2 weeks after the storm, Tella was organizing the cellar, sorting through their salvaged belongings, taking inventory of what they had left. She'd been working for an hour when Delra heard her call out, her voice strange. "Orin, Delra, you need to come down here." They found Tella sitting on the cellar floor, surrounded by boxes and crates. In her hands was an envelope, yellowed with age. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "What is it?" Orin asked, kneeling beside her. "A letter," Tella whispered. "From Patrice. I found it in my personal box, the one I sealed after she couldn't finish the sentence." Orin took the envelope carefully. The postmark read 5 years earlier. It had been opened once, the seal broken, but the letter inside remained unread. The return address was from Massachusetts. "Why didn't you read it?" Delra asked gently. Tella's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid. It came right after we'd tried calling her, and the number was disconnected. I thought it would be rejection. That she was writing to tell us to leave her alone, to stop trying. I couldn't bear to read that, so I put it away. And then I forgot about it, or maybe I made myself forget. I don't know. Do you want to read it now? Orin's voice was barely audible. Tella nodded. Together. All of us. They climbed back up to the barn, and Orin built up the fire. They sat together, the three of them on one of the bunks, while Orin unfolded the letter with careful hands. The paper was thin, covered in neat handwriting. He began to read aloud. Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know if you'll even read this. I don't know if you want to hear from me after everything I've done, all the ways I've failed you. But I need to try. I need you to know that I'm sorry. Orin's voice cracked. He paused, swallowed hard, and continued. I've been clean for 18 months. Really clean this time, not just saying it. I'm in a program, working with a counselor, taking it one day at a time. I have a job, nothing fancy, just retail and a small apartment. I'm paying my bills. I'm showing up for my life. And I have a daughter. Her name is Emma. She's 3 years old, and she's the reason I got clean. I couldn't be the mother she needed while I was using, so I stopped. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it. Tella made a sound, half sob, half gasp. A granddaughter. They had a granddaughter they'd never known about. Orin continued reading, his voice shaking. I know I hurt you. I know I said terrible things, blamed you for things that weren't your fault. After Jacob died, I was so angry at God, at the world, at you for surviving when he didn't. That wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But I took my pain and turned it into poison, and I've been carrying that poison for 20 years. I want to stop now. I want to come home, if you'll have me. I want you to meet your granddaughter. I want Emma to know where she comes from, who her people are. The number below is my current phone. If you want to call, I'll answer. If you don't, I'll understand. But please know that I love you. I've always loved you, even when I couldn't show it. Your daughter, Patrice. Silence filled the barn. Orin sat with the letter in his hands, staring at it as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd read. Tella wept openly, her whole body shaking with the weight of 5 lost years. Delra felt her own tears coming hot and fierce. 5 years, Tella said. She wrote this 5 years ago. She was waiting for us to call, and we never did. We never even knew. The phone number, Orin said suddenly. We need to try it. Right now. The pass is closed, Delra reminded them gently. There's no way to get to town until spring. No phone lines up here. The despair on their faces was crushing. To have come so close, to know their daughter had reached out, had wanted them, had been waiting, and to be trapped here, unable to respond. Spring, Orin said. As soon as the pass opens, we go to town. We call her. We tell her. His voice broke completely. Delra made a decision in that moment. I'll write to her, a letter, explaining everything, the storm, why you didn't respond, how much you love her. We'll keep it ready, and the second I can get to town, I'll mail it overnight. She'll know you want her. She'll know. What if it's too late? Tella asked. What if she's given up on us? What if she thinks we rejected her? Then we'll find her anyway, Delra said firmly. We'll hire an investigator if we have to. We'll track her down and tell her face to face. But we won't let another 5 years pass. Not now. That night, none of them slept well. The letter had cracked open something in all of them. Hope mixed with regret, joy tangled with grief. Delra lay in her bunk, thinking about parallel lives. About Patrice writing that letter 5 years ago, hoping for a response that never came. About Sophie, wherever she was, maybe wondering if Delra ever thought about her. The next morning, Delra pulled out paper and began writing. Not to Patrice, not yet. That letter would come from Orin and Tella. Their words, their love. No, Delra was writing to her own daughter. The letter she'd been composing in her head for weeks, maybe years. Dear Sophie, she wrote, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you want to hear from me after 8 years of silence, but I need to try. The words came slowly at first, then faster. An apology real and unqualified. An acknowledgement of her failures as a mother. An explanation of where she'd been, what she'd learned. A confession of regret so deep it felt like drowning. I was wrong, she wrote, about your husband, about your choices, about everything I said that day. I let pride keep me from reaching out, and I've lost 8 years of your life because of it. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I need you to know I've learned what matters, and what matters is love, connection, being willing to stay even when it's hard. I'm learning that now, here on this mountain, with 2 people who showed me what real commitment looks like. I only wish I'd learned it sooner. She wrote about the Varns, about the storm, about choosing to stay. She wrote about Patrice's letter and the 5 lost years, the painful lesson in how silence could destroy what love built. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes burned. I don't expect you to respond, she finished. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I think about you every day, that I'm sorry, that I love you, and I always have, even when I was too stubborn to show it. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here, waiting, for as long as it takes, your mother. She sealed the letter and put it with the one Orin and Tella had written to Patrice. 2 letters, 2 families, 2 chances at redemption. All they could do now was wait for spring and hope it wasn't too late. Winter deepened. January brought temperatures that rarely climbed above 0 and snow that fell in steady, relentless waves. The world beyond the barns ceased to exist. There was only the small circle of their survival, the daily rituals that kept them alive. Firewood and food, water and warmth, the fundamental mathematics of existence. Tella's condition stabilized but didn't improve. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. The cough came and went, never quite leaving, a reminder of how fragile her hold on health had become. Orin watched her with barely concealed fear, his own body betraying him more each day. His hands were gnarled now, the arthritis so severe that some mornings he couldn't grip a cup without help. Delra carried more of the burden, but she didn't mind. This was what staying meant, taking up the slack, being there when needed, showing up day after day, even when exhaustion made her bones ache. She was stronger than the Varns, younger, healthier. It was her job to keep them alive until spring. The letters sat on the shelf above the fire, sealed and ready. Delra rewrote hers 3 times, trying to find the right words. Too much apology felt weak, too little felt cold. In the end, she settled on honesty raw, unpolished truth about her failures and her hope for something better. Orin and Tella's letter to Patrice went through similar revisions. They debated every word, every phrase, trying to convey 5 years of love and regret in a few pages. Finally, Delra made them stop. It doesn't have to be perfect, she said. It just has to be real. She'll hear your heart in it, no matter what words you use. In late February, Garrett made it through with news. The warming trend that had started in the valleys was moving up the mountain. Within 2 weeks, maybe 3, the pass would be navigable on horseback. Not easy, but possible. He also brought news from town. Sandra Cook from County Services had been asking about the Varns, making calls, filing reports. There would be an official visit in early spring to assess their situation. She's determined, Garrett said. Thinks you folks are being stubborn and reckless. Wants to move you to a care facility in Missoula. Over my dead body, Tella said quietly. After Garrett left, they discussed what the county visit would mean. An assessment of their living conditions, their health, their ability to care for themselves. Sandra would have the authority to declare them unfit and force relocation. The thought sent Orin into a dark spiral that lasted 3 days, silent, withdrawn, staring at the walls. We'll show them we're fine, Delra said. We'll clean everything up, demonstrate we have supplies and capability. We'll pass whatever assessment they throw at us. And if we don't? Orin asked. Delra didn't have an answer for that. The first warming day came in early March. Temperatures climbed into the 40s, and the snow began to melt in earnest. Water ran everywhere, off the roof, down the hillsides, turning the ground into thick mud. The sound of dripping was constant, a reminder that winter's grip was loosening. Delra began preparing for the journey to town. She'd need to go soon, before the melt made the trails completely impassable, but after enough had melted to make travel possible. It was a narrow window, and timing would be critical. She checked Stedman's shoes, inventoried her supplies, studied the routes. The night before she planned to leave, the three of them sat around the fire one last time. The barn felt smaller somehow, or maybe they'd just grown, to fill the space more completely. This place that had started as a desperate shelter had become home. Not comfortable, not ideal, but home nonetheless. "Tell me what you'll say," Tella said, "when you call Patrice." Delra had thought about this. "I'll tell her who I am and why I'm calling. I'll tell her that you received her letter, that you never stopped loving her, never stopped hoping she'd come home. I'll tell her about the storm and why you couldn't respond sooner. And I'll give her your number, tell her you're waiting to hear from her." What if she's angry? What if she thinks we deliberately ignored her? Then I'll explain until she understands. I'll make her listen. I won't hang up until she knows the truth. Orin stirred the fire. "What about your daughter? Will you call her too?" "I'll try. If she doesn't answer, I'll leave a message, and I'll mail the letter regardless. She deserves to know I tried." "She deserves more than that," Tella said gently. "She deserves to hear your voice, to know you mean it. Don't hide behind paper, Delra. Be brave." Delra nodded, throat tight. Being brave, that's what this all came down to. Having the courage to reach out, to risk rejection, to lay your heart bare and hope the other person didn't crush it. She'd spent 8 years avoiding that risk. Time to stop hiding. Morning came cold and clear. Delra, dressed in layers, packed supplies for a 2-day journey and checked her gear twice. The letters were wrapped in waterproof oilcloth and tucked safely in her saddlebag. Stedman was rested and ready, his breath steaming in the frigid air. Orin and Tella came out to see her off. They looked small, standing there in the melting snow, 2 old people who'd survived against all odds. Delra felt a fierce surge of love and protectiveness. These were her people now, her family, not by blood, but by choice. That made it stronger somehow. "Be careful," Orin said. "The trails will be treacherous with all this melt." "I'll be fine. I've ridden worse." Delra mounted Stedman, adjusting the reins. "Keep the fire going, ration the food, don't overwork yourselves. I'll be back in 3 days at most." "We'll be here," Tella said, waiting. Delra kicked Stedman into motion. She turned once to look back and saw them standing together, Orin's arm around Tella's shoulders, watching her ride away. The image burned itself into her memory, 2 people who'd lost everything and kept going, who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. They'd taught her more about courage than anyone in her life. The journey was as difficult as she'd feared. The trails were a mess, half ice, half running water, with soft spots that could swallow a horse's leg if you weren't careful. Fallen trees blocked the path in multiple places, requiring long detours. The creek crossing was terrifying, the water running high and fast with snowmelt. Stedman balked at first, and Delra had to coax him across inch by inch, her heart in her throat the whole time. They made it, but barely. Stedman was trembling when they reached the far bank, and Delra wasn't much better. She stopped to let him rest and catch her own breath, the adrenaline slowly fading. Looking back at the churning water, she realized how close they'd come to disaster. One misstep and they both could have been swept away. She pushed on. By nightfall, she'd covered half the distance to town. She made camp in a protected grove, building a fire and settling in for a cold night. Alone for the first time in months, she felt the absence of Orin and Tella acutely. She'd gotten used to their presence, the sound of their breathing, the knowledge that she wasn't facing the darkness alone. She pulled out her letter to Sophie and read it by firelight. The words felt inadequate now, too small to carry the weight of 8 years of silence and regret, but they were all she had. "I don't know if you can forgive me," she read aloud to the empty forest, "but I need you to know I've learned what matters. What matters? Connection over isolation, love over pride, staying over leaving." The Varns had taught her that, lived it every day in the way they cared for each other, in their refusal to abandon the land that held their memories. She'd learned by watching them, by being part of their survival. Now it was time to take those lessons and apply them to her own broken family. Morning came grey and cold. Delra broke camp and rode on, pushing Stedman as hard as she dared. By late afternoon, the town of Derby came into view, a small cluster of buildings against the mountain backdrop, smoke rising from chimneys, signs of human life and civilization. It looked strange after months in isolation, almost overwhelming. She rode straight to the general store, her heart pounding. Everything depended on what happened next. 2 phone calls, 2 chances at redemption, 2 families waiting for news. She dismounted, tied Stedman, and walked toward the door. Her hands were shaking. She paused on the threshold, gathering her courage. "Be brave," she whispered to herself, hearing Tella's voice in the words. Then she pushed open the door and stepped inside. "Mrs." Brennan looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening. "Delra Quinn. Wasn't sure we'd see you again before the pass fully cleared. How are the Varns?" "They're alive. We all are." Delra's voice came out rougher than intended. "I need to use your phone. It's important." "Of course." "Mrs." Brennan gestured to the phone on the counter, an old rotary model that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Take your time." Delra pulled out the letter from Patrice, found the phone number at the bottom. Her hands trembled as she dialed. Each rotation of the dial felt eternal. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. What if no one answered? What if the number had changed after 5 years? What if... "Hello?" A woman's voice, cautious. "Is this Patrice Varn?" A pause. "Yes." "Who's calling?" "My name is Delra Quinn. I'm calling about your parents, Orin and Tella." The silence that followed was so complete, Delra thought the line had gone dead. Then, "Are they okay? Are my parents alive?" The fear in her voice was raw, immediate. Delra rushed to reassure her. "They're fine. They're both alive. I'm calling because this is complicated. Can I explain?" "Please." Patrice's voice cracked. Delra told the story quickly, the storm, the destruction, her decision to stay and help. The discovery of the letter 2 weeks ago, unopened for 5 years, because Tella had been afraid to read it. The winter they'd survived together, isolated and fighting to make it to spring. "They never got my letter?" Patrice asked. "They never knew I'd gotten clean, that I had Emma, that I wanted to come home?" "Your mother was afraid. She thought it would be rejection, so she put it away. It was only when we were sorting supplies that she found it again. When they..." "Read it," Delra's voice caught. "It broke their hearts. 5 years lost because of fear." Patrice was crying now, the sound coming through the phone line broken and desperate. "I thought they didn't want me. When they never called, never wrote back, I thought I'd hurt them too much, that they'd given up on me." "They never gave up. They tried to find you. Called, sent letters. Everything came back. They thought you didn't want them. God." The word was half prayer, half curse. "All this time, we were both waiting, both too afraid to try again. They want you to come home," Delra said. "As soon as the roads are fully clear. They want to meet Emma. They want to be a family again. Are they really okay? You said they're alive," but Delra was honest. "They're old. Tella's health isn't great, and Orin's arthritis is bad. They're living in a barn because the house was destroyed. It's not easy. But they're fighting. They're stubborn and determined, and they refuse to give up on the land they've spent 50 years building." "That sounds like them." Patrice laughed through her tears. When can I come? Can I call them? The pass won't be fully clear until late March, maybe early April. It's too dangerous right now. But I'll give you the number for the general store here in town. You can call and leave messages. I'll be making trips down periodically to check in and bring supplies. We can coordinate that way. They exchanged information, phone numbers, addresses, plans. Patrice promised she'd come as soon as it was safe, would bring Emma and her husband. She asked a dozen questions about her parents' health, their situation, what they needed. Delra answered as honestly as she could. "Thank you," Patrice said finally, "for staying with them, for taking care of them. I don't know why you did it, but thank you." "They're good people," Delra said simply. "They deserved someone to stay." After the call ended, Delra stood, holding the phone, processing what had just happened. The first reconciliation successful. Patrice would come home. Orin and Tella would meet their granddaughter. 5 lost years couldn't be recovered, but the future was still possible. That had to be enough. Mrs. Brennan brought her coffee and a kind smile. That sounded like good news. It was. Delra sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. One more call to make, though. This one's personal. She pulled out her letter to Sophie, found her daughter's number, the last one she had. Probably disconnected by now. She dialed anyway, heart hammering. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Then voicemail, "Hi, this is Sophie. Leave a message." Her daughter's voice. After 8 years, hearing it felt like being struck by lightning. Delra opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. "Sophie, it's your mother. I know I have no right to call after all this time. I was wrong. About everything. About him. About how I spoke to you. I've been..." The beep cut her off. Message too long. She hung up, frustrated and devastated. She'd had one chance and had wasted half of it stumbling over words. She stood there, staring at the phone, wondering if she should try again. Then it rang. Mrs. Brennan answered. Derby General Store. She listened, then held out the phone to Delra. "For you, someone calling back." Delra took the phone with shaking hands. "Hello, Mom?" The world stopped. Sophie's voice, tentative and shocked, but real. After 8 years of silence, her daughter was on the other end of the line, speaking to her. "Sophie." Delra's voice broke completely. "You called back." "I was at work," Sophie said. "I saw a missed call from a Montana number I didn't recognize. And then I listened to the voicemail and I heard your voice. I didn't think you'd call back." Delra gripped the phone like it might dissolve. "I thought after all this time, I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Sophie's voice was controlled, careful. 8 years, Mom. 8 years of nothing. I know. I'm sorry. God, Sophie, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't..." Sophie stopped, took a breath. "Why now, after all this time? Why are you calling now?" Delra told her. About the Varns, about the storm, about choosing to stay when every instinct told her to leave, about watching 2 people who'd been together for 50 years care for each other through impossible circumstances, about Patrice's unopened letter and the 5 years lost to fear and pride. "I saw what I'd done," Delra said. "I saw how I'd let pride destroy something that mattered. And I couldn't let another day go by without trying to fix it. Even if you hate me, even if you hang up right now and never speak to me again. I needed you to know that I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I think about you every single day." Silence on the line. Then, "You stayed with them? You, who couldn't even stay for my wedding." The accusation hurt because it was true. I know what that sounds like. The woman who pushed everyone away suddenly playing caretaker to strangers. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't sound like the mother I knew. Maybe I'm not her anymore. Or maybe, Delra struggled for words, maybe I'm finally learning how to be who I should have been all along. "You said terrible things." Sophie's voice was thick with old pain. "You told me I was making the same mistakes you made, that I was throwing my life away, that my husband, that James wasn't good enough, would never be good enough. I was wrong. Delra said it clearly, without qualification. He's still your husband. 10 years this June. Then he's clearly better than I gave him credit for, and you were right to marry him, and I was wrong to try to stop you. I was projecting my own failures onto your life, and that wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Another long silence. Delra waited, barely breathing. I've thought about calling you, Sophie admitted, especially after... She stopped. After what? After I had Lily, your granddaughter. She's 3 now. The world tilted. Delra had to sit down on the stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. I'm a grandmother? You didn't know. Sophie's voice was sad, not accusatory. How could you know? We haven't spoken in 8 years. Tell me about her. Please. Sophie did. Lily was 3 years old, smart and stubborn and funny. She looked like Sophie had as a child, dark hair, bright eyes, always asking questions. James was a good father, patient and kind. They lived in Oregon now, had a small house with a yard. Sophie worked part-time as a nurse. They were happy. I wanted to tell you, Sophie said. When I found out I was pregnant, the first person I wanted to call was you. But I was still so angry, and I was afraid you'd say something about how I wasn't ready, or how I'd mess it up like you thought you'd messed me up, so I didn't call. I would have, Delra admitted. 8 years ago, I would have said exactly that. I would have found a way to make it about my fears instead of your joy. But I hope I'm different now. I hope I could just be happy for you. Are you? Happy for me? So happy, and so sorry I missed it. That I missed her. Delra wiped at her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve a relationship with you or Lily, but I want one. If you're willing to try, I want to try. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. You hurt me. Really badly. It's taken me years to stop being angry about what you said. I know. And one phone call doesn't fix 8 years of silence. I know that too. But, Sophie took a breath, but I've been thinking about reaching out too, especially since having Lily. Becoming a mother, it makes you understand your own parents differently. The fear, the worry, the desperate need to protect them from making mistakes. It doesn't excuse what you said, but I understand it better now. I don't want to pressure you, Delra said. We can take this as slow as you need. Maybe we could talk again? When I get back to the mountain, I'll be making trips to town periodically. I could call, and we could just talk. Get to know each other again. I'd like that. Sophie's voice was cautious but genuine. Maybe once a week? When you can get to a phone? Every week, I promise. And Mom, I read your letter. The one you mentioned in the voicemail. I want to read it. I'll mail it today, overnight if I can. They talked for a few more minutes, careful conversation, tentative, like two people learning a new language. Sophie asked about the Varns, about the mountain, about Delra's plans. Delra asked about Lily, about James, about Sophie's work. Nothing deep, nothing that couldn't be taken back. But it was a beginning. When they finally hung up, Delra sat at the counter for a long time, the phone silent in her hand. Mrs. Brennan came over with a box of tissues, and Delra realized her face was wet with tears. Good news or bad? Mrs. Brennan asked gently. Good, Delra managed. Really good. She mailed both letters, one to Patrice from the Varns, one to Sophie from herself. She included her contact information, the address for the general store, instructions for how to reach her. Then she bought supplies for the return trip and a few small things she thought Orin and Tella might enjoy: real coffee, chocolate, a book about carpentry. As she prepared to leave town, Delra felt lighter than she had in years. 2 reconciliations in one day, messy, imperfect, but real. Patrice would come home. Sophie would call again. The walls she'd spent 8 years building were starting to come down, brick by brick. The ride back to the homestead took 2 days. The trails were still treacherous, but Delra navigated them with new confidence. She had news to share, hope to bring. When she finally crested the ridge and saw the barn in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, her heart swelled. Home. That's what this place had become. Not her cabin in the high country, but this makeshift shelter where 3 people had learned to be family. Orin and Tella came out when they heard Steadman's hooves. Delra dismounted, and they rushed to her as much as 2 people in their late 70s could rush. The questions came fast. Did you make it? Did you call? What did she say? She's coming home, Delra said, and watched joy transform their faces. Patrice is coming home, as soon as the road's clear. She never stopped loving you. She was waiting, just like you were waiting. And she has a daughter, Emma. You have a granddaughter. Tella collapsed into Orin's arms, sobbing. Orin held her, his own eyes streaming, whispering thank you over and over. Delra stood watching them, giving them this moment. Then Tella reached out and pulled Delra into the embrace, and the 3 of them stood there in the melting snow, holding each other and crying and laughing all at once. What about you? Orin asked when they'd finally calmed down. Did you call your daughter? I did. We talked. She wants to try. We're going to talk every week. She has a daughter too. Lily, I'm a grandmother. Oh, Delra. Tella squeezed her hand. That's wonderful. They went inside the barn, and Delra told them everything, both conversations, every word she could remember. They sat together around the fire, and for the first time since the storm, the future felt possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. That was enough. Spring came slowly, then all at once. By late March, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, and the valley was alive with running water and new green growth. The trails cleared enough for regular travel, and Delra made weekly trips to town for supplies and phone calls. Each conversation with Sophie felt a little easier, a little more honest. They were learning each other again, carefully rebuilding trust. Patrice arrived in early April with her husband Tom and their daughter Emma. Delra watched from the barn as their truck navigated the muddy road, saw Orin and Tella standing together with their hands clasped, trembling with anticipation. Patrice stepped out of the truck, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then she was running, a middle-aged woman running like a child toward her parents. Orin caught her, and Tella wrapped her arms around them both, and all 3 of them collapsed into tears. Tom stood back with Emma, giving them space for reunion. Emma was 5 years old now. The letter had been written when she was 3, with dark curls and curious eyes. She watched her mother cry with confusion, then asked loudly, "Are those my grandparents?" "Yes, baby," Patrice said through her tears. "Those are your grandparents." Emma marched over and announced, "I'm Emma Louise Mitchell, and I'm 5.5 years old, and I can write my whole name." Orin dropped to his knees, arthritis forgotten, and looked at this child, his granddaughter, with wonder. "It's very nice to meet you, Emma Louise Mitchell. I'm your grandfather, Orin, and this is your grandmother, Tella." "You live in a barn," Emma observed. "Why do you live in a barn?" "Because a storm knocked down our house," Tella said, kneeling beside Orin. "But we're going to build a new one. Would you like to help?" Emma considered this seriously. "I'm very good at building. I have blocks." "Then you'll be perfect." The week that followed was chaos and joy mixed together. Patrice couldn't stop apologizing for the lost years, for the pain she'd caused, for everything. Orin and Tella kept telling her to stop, that none of it mattered now, that she was home, and that was all they needed. Tom proved to be handy with tools, and he and Orin began planning a small house that could be built over the summer. Emma explored everything, asking 1,000 questions and filling the barn with laughter. Delra felt herself becoming part of the fabric of this family, not an outsider anymore, but woven in someone who belonged Patrice thanked her repeatedly for staying with her parents, for keeping them alive through the winter. "You gave us back our family," Patrice said. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay family," Delra said. "You just love them." Sophie called 3 weeks later with news. She and James and Lily wanted to visit. Could they come in June? Delra said yes before she'd fully processed the question. "Yes, please, yes." The county visit happened in early May. Sandra Cook arrived with forms and authority, ready to declare the Varns unfit and force relocation. But what she found was not 2 elderly people barely surviving. She found a family, Patrice and Tom, staying in the barn with her parents. Plans drawn up for a new house, supplies well stocked, everyone healthy and cared for. "Your daughter lives in Blanc, Massachusetts," Sandra said. "How is this sustainable?" "We're moving back," Patrice said. "Tom can work remotely, and I can find a job in Missoula. We're going to help them rebuild. This is our home now, too." Sandra looked around at the makeshift shelter, at the ruins of the old house, at the mountains rising beyond. "You're sure about this?" "Absolutely certain," Patrice said. Sandra left without filing removal orders. "She'd check back in 6 months," she said. "But for now, the Varns could stay." Delra watched her drive away and felt a weight lift. They'd won. Against the storm, the winter, the county, their own fears, they'd won. June brought Sophie. Delra waited at the homestead, more nervous than she'd been in her entire life. When the car pulled up and her daughter stepped out, older now, a woman instead of the girl, Delra remembered her heart nearly stopped. And beside her, a small, dark-haired child with bright eyes. "Hi, Mom," Sophie said. They stood for a moment, 8 years of silence between them. Then Sophie stepped forward and hugged her, and Delra held her daughter for the first time in nearly a decade. "I'm so sorry," Delra whispered. "For everything." "I know," Sophie said. "Me too." Lily was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs. But Emma took her hand and announced they were going to be best friends and led her off to explore. The 2 granddaughters, instant allies. The days that followed were full, 2 families overlapping, building, talking, healing. Orin taught the girls about woodwork. Tella told them stories. James and Tom worked together on the new house frame. Patrice and Sophie discovered they had much in common, became friends in their own right. Delra moved between them all, part of something larger than herself. One evening, they all gathered outside, 7 adults and 2 children, sitting on makeshift benches, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Garrett came by with his camera and offered to take a photograph. They arranged themselves in front of the new house frame, Orin and Tella in the center, Patrice and Tom on one side, Sophie and James on the other, Delra beside them, the 2 girls in front. "Everyone smile," Garrett said. "This is history right here." The camera clicked. In that frozen moment, Delra felt complete in a way she never had before. This was family not perfect, not without scars, but real. Built not from blood but from choice, from staying when leaving would have been easier, from forgiveness and stubbornness and love. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Delra sat alone by the dying fire. She pulled out her old fire lookout logbook and made a final entry. Not weather observations, but something more. Sometimes the worst storms give us what we didn't know we needed. Not comfort, not ease, but connection. The chance to say the words we were too proud to say. To stay when staying seemed impossible. To rebuild what mattered most, not houses, but home. Found mine here, among the wreckage. 3 people became family, then 4, then 5, then 9. All of us learning together what it means to choose each other every single day. This is where I belong. Not in solitude, but here surrounded by people who need me and whom I need in return. This is home. She closed the book and looked at the barn where everyone slept. Lily and Emma shared Delra's old bunk, whispering to each other in the dark. Sophie and James had the loft. Patrice and Tom were in makeshift quarters outside. Orin and Tella in their familiar corner, holding hands even in sleep. In the morning, they'd work on the house again. Orin would teach the girls more carpentry. Tella would cook from her recipe box. They'd tell stories and argue about the best way to frame a window and laugh at Emma's endless questions. They'd build, together, something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Delra stood and walked to the barn door, looking out at the mountains. The same peaks. She'd watched from her cabin for 15 years, but they looked different now. Not lonely, but protective. A guardian watching over the valley where her family lived. She thought about that first day riding through the wreckage, finding two old people who refused to leave, making the choice to stay. 4 words that had changed everything. I'll stay with you. She would stay, not just for the summer, not just until the house was built. She'd stay because this was where she belonged. Because families weren't found in blood alone, but in the daily choice to show up, to help, to love. Because home wasn't a place, it was the people you chose and who chose you in return. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Life continuing, as it always did, one choice at a time. Delra smiled, turned back to the barn, and went inside to join her family.